All right, so grading seriously in process of sorry. Hoping to finish all the 15s today, 16s tomorrow, 17s maybe on Thursday. We'll see how it goes. Kind of depends. But at the very least, I think I should be done by Friday. Lots of questions, mostly from your class, about how many times you can do the quiz once. Because, after you've seen all the questions, it is a little easier. So I get that. There were a couple people who argued that their answer was better than the one I said was correct on the quiz, and I'll respond to that. I just haven't yet because busy. Sorry, got behind on stuff. Had a conference for 2 or 3 days, and just really haven't caught up since then. But I should be caught up by Friday is the goal. Some of you like, how come you haven't posted this or that? It's posted. You just have to be patient. So the weekly questions are in the assignment section. They're also in the course document section, and I put the notes in the course document section too. Yeah, and yeah, if you guys, sometimes I get that you go in and out, so yeah, don't worry about that at all. That happens a lot. Hopefully it didn't happen to me. That makes me nervous a little, I'm not gonna lie. Because I worry if I go out, if you guys will come back. You know what I'm saying? All right, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else I'm supposed to tell you. I don't think so. There were some people, and I think there may have been a few in your class that only did the quiz and didn't do the weekly questions. The weekly questions, once they're all done, they're about half your grade. So you will not pass if you don't turn in the weekly questions. I don't know, how people missed out on that information, but somebody did. So you've got to do the weekly questions. You have to. I mean, well, only if you want to pass. You don't have to. I can't make you, but passing is good. And, again, I should be done talking about that or grading that stuff pretty quick. All right. So we're starting today with progressive era. So let's look at the weekly question for this week, which is, compare and contrast new nationalism and new freedom programs. Be sure to mention details of each plan, including who devised the plan and what they include. I'm going to assume that you'll tell me like which one was enacted and if there was anything odd about it. And hopefully I'm right about that. This happens at the end of chapter 18, so we'll talk about it pretty extensively next time, but not today. And just the preview. These are both plans by presidential candidates. New Nationalism is the plan by Teddy Roosevelt, 1912 election. Teddy Roosevelt was president before 1912 and will be not president after. New Freedom Plan, which is the plan devised by Woodrow Wilson. And these guys are running against another person, William Howard Taft. And moderately interesting because all three of those guys will be president at some point. So they're fairly successful politicians. What you'll notice about the progressive era is the goal of the progressive era seems to be to use government power to enact some social change. So New Nationalism, as you might guess, is a plan to do that on the national level. New Freedom, really same changes, but devised or enacted more on the state level. So there you go. And we'll start talking about the chapter stuff. Yeah, chapter stuff. So chapter 18 notes. And if you didn't get these, I did post them, but I just posted them today. So they should be available in your course documents page. And I'm going to assume you are paying attention to me instead of working on your physics, your pre-cal, or that crazy English class where you write all the papers. Okay, so pay attention. It'll be fun. All right, so progressive era. This is the era where we want to change stuff. We primarily want to change the stuff that we looked at and thought was a little messed up from the Gilded Age, with the glaring exception of anything to do with race or ethnicity. We're just not in the mood to change that stuff. Now, there'll be a couple of groups that'll develop a little later, that will try to take those things on, and we'll talk about them later, Niagara Movement and the NAACP, but we really talk a little more about them in the, sorry for the yawn, chapter about the 1920s. Okay, some things that are unique to this era. More people live in the city than in the country. That's kind of a new thing. And do you have any thoughts about why people might move to the city during this era? Any thoughts at all that you would like to share? Say it or type it. We can listen to my wind chimes. Okay. All right, I'm looking. I see you typing. Yep, work and jobs. That's it. So you got factories, and factories tend to be in cities or near cities during that time period, actually in cities. In our era, usually a little more near cities. So people are moving from the country to the city for jobs, and by 1920, a majority of people will live in the cities. So that will change politics and changes a lot of stuff. So we have urbanization, which happened over a 30-year period, and most of the reform that you'll notice that's proposed during this era really is reform for these cities. So the initial push for this reform doesn't come from politicians, it comes from writers, from journalists, really. And sometimes these journalists, will be well received. At other times, they will be not well received. Initially, they're probably not well received. Over time, people start to see that there's a real need for change. So writers, city leaders will begin to call for professionalism of city management. So not just the elected people running the city, but you hire people who are trained to run water systems, public health, that kind of thing, city management. So you end up having a city manager who does the day-to-day stuff and a mayor who does the political stuff and typically just agrees with what the city staff wants done because they're the professionals and the mayor does something else for a living. It's not 100% true, and I'm not trying to discount the leadership of the elected officials, but the day-to-day stuff, yeah, more from the the city bureaucracy. That's a move away from political machines where you had a group of people that controlled city government really for their own personal benefit and toward city planning and bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, sometimes when we hear that word, we think of like 5 layers of people I have to go through to get what I want from the city or the government. They were thinking of it as more professional staff that understands the process better and it's less political. That's sort of the thing. I don't know if it works that way or not. I know that, sometimes in cities, if you know somebody who's important, it helps you get what you want faster. I trust that that's true, especially if you live in cities, near us, like Leander, Cedar Park. It's probably even true in Austin, even though it's bigger. All right, journalists were sometimes, like I mentioned, not well received at first and even called names. Can you imagine politicians calling people names? It is shocking. Politicians, namely Teddy Roosevelt at first, called the investigative journalists muckrakers, guys that just stir stuff up, purveyors of fake news, if you will. So they're just causing trouble so that people will buy their magazines or their newspapers or pay attention to them or watch them on whatever news channel in the modern era. Okay, so they're raking up nasty stuff and maybe telling half the story or maybe just making stuff up completely. But what Teddy Roosevelt started to notice is that some of the things they complained about, it looks like, honestly, in this era, a lot of the things they complained about were actually true. So muckrakers investigated stuff. Sometimes it was bad. They wrote about it, and then people started reading about it and then looking into it even more. And a lot of times these books were written, and then journalists, local journalists, would go and look into it, and they go like, yeah, that's true. So here are some famous books from the era, any of which you could use for your book review if you wanted to. How the Other Half Lives, which is, I've mentioned that like 5 times. You can find that online. It's the guy, Jacob Reese, who goes from neighborhood to neighborhood in New York City, describing living and working conditions. He also will make comments about different ethnic groups, which will often you would look at and go like, I can't believe he said that. Yeah, he's gonna say that. And what that part of the book does is reveal the acceptable prejudices of the time. But that's not the goal of the book. The goal of the book is to show you what living conditions are like. And he certainly does that as well. Shame of the Cities, Lincoln Steffens, is about cleaning up city government, and I believe it's specific to Cleveland. Lewis Hine writes about and photographs child labor, and almost any child labor photo that you see from the early 20th century is his. And his goal is to end child labor. He is not terribly, he brings a lot of awareness to the issue, and the Congress will pass some child labor laws which are later ruled unconstitutional, not because the Supreme Court thinks 5-year-olds should be at work, but because honestly politicians wrote some really bad laws. And what else? Oh, the jungle. This is what your 11th grade history teacher, if you had 11th grade US history at Cedar Park High School, would probably share with you. And it is a book about meat packing plants, conditions in meat packing plants. It's really a novel about a group of people that move over from Central or Eastern Europe, and they move to Chicago. It's called Packing Town in the novel. And they're young and energetic, and they've heard good things and bad things about the United States, but because they're young, nothing can harm them. Everything's going to be perfect. They're going to be Andrew Carnegie within 10 years. And that's not exactly how it turns out. So by the end of the book, the main character's lost his family, lost his job, lost his health, and he thinks socialism is the answer. So the purpose of this book is to persuade the reader that socialism is the answer, especially for people who, you know, immigrate or move to the city from the country and don't become Andrew Carnegie and get taken advantage of. What most people remember from the book is that conditions in meat packing plants are disgusting. There's a particular chapter where they talk about gross stuff that ends up in your sausage. That is typically the section that most high school teachers will have you read. And there's another section where people end up in the lard. That's, you know, also memorable. So the novel, not terribly well written, but written by journalists who really just want you to ask for political reform. What ends up happening is the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Both of those things are super important. And it means there's not as much gross stuff in your sausage in the modern era. If you're wondering what the Pure Food and Drug Act did, it required companies to put labels, ingredient labels on food and drug products, which fairly important as well because they put in sawdust and things that weren't food in your food sometimes. And they also put alcohol and laudanum and cocaine and things like that in your medication, which might make you feel better temporarily, but probably would not solve your physical problems. So, all right, but any reformer book, the Ida Tarbell is pretty famous. She wrote about Standard Oil and Rockefeller, and there are books about the steel industry during that time period and how many people are injured in that. So there are lots of things you could read from that time period if you wanted to for your book review. Again, no pressure, just mentioning. All right, labor unions are fairly active during this time period. The two major labor unions are the American Federation of Labor, which of course is more of a it's a US-based union, and the International or Industrial Workers of the World, which is an international union. So the AFL is fairly conservative. They just want what union members typically want: better wages, better working conditions, and better, fewer hours. So better and safe. Yeah, I said that. Safer working conditions, better wages, better hours. This is for skilled laborers, white men, so it's not very inclusive, but the membership triples in the early 1900s, so they'll have over 1 million. I think it's like 2 million members. The IWW, international and communist / socialist, so they want what communists and socialists want, which is for someone other than the business owner to run the business. So the business would be run by either the people who work at the business or the government. So they want the government or the workers to have control of the means of production. This is really in an era where socialism is a little more theoretical. We haven't had any big socialist revolutions just yet, but they're just about. So it's coming. All right.
Turn down the volume.
Are you guys asking questions or are you just needing to mute yourselves?
Tell her to kill us.
I'm gonna guess with needing to mute yourselves. All right, so mute yourself. How often is that said in a Zoom meeting? So international workers of the world, don't be a communist, mute yourself. Socialist Party becomes more active during this time period, and the Socialist Party of America will win local and state elections, and they will run a presidential candidate or two. It's really just one, Eugene Debs. He runs a lot. If you study Eugene Debs, you could read a book about Eugene Debs. I'm certain there are several written. He runs for president from jail from time to time, but he's in jail for leading strikes and being a union leader, so he's not super thuggish. You'll notice he's an old dude that weighs about 100 pounds, and he's not super dangerous. Personally, some people thought his ideas might be, and certainly if you owned a business, you didn't always appreciate him if he's leading a strike against your business. All right, and do you have any questions about any of that stuff about labor? Before we go on to birth control, which is a very weird subject for US history and progressive era, but you know, it fits. All right, one of the other concerns of some progressive activists was birth control, and they wanted people to have more information about birth control. During this time period, it's honestly illegal for you to talk about birth control in a public forum or with your doctor. It's considered pornographic or obscene. So you couldn't talk about it. And if people ask their doctors or their nurses what they could do to limit the number of people in their family, they would mostly say, stay away from your husband or have him sleep on the roof or something like that. You're wondering what sort of birth control is available during this time period? Just ancient methods of birth control, which would be making sure you are not producing children, so no sex, or condoms, which are as old as written history, but they're just made out of different things over time. So there's nothing new. Birth control pill is more of it's around 1960 when that's developed. And actually Margaret Sanger has something to do with that. She leaves her estate for research of the birth control pill or contributes to it, and then eventually leaves her estate for research. Margaret Sanger is a health nurse, public health nurse in New York City, and she gets frustrated because she can't help women who ask, what can I do to limit my family? People who are upper middle class, wealthier people had better access to information. A lot of this tended to be booked from overseas, that sort of thing, where it wasn't as forbidden for you to talk about these things. So she ends up quitting her job as the public health nurse and instead goes around giving lectures about birth control and family limitation and family planning, to the extent that she'll get arrested and she'll eventually leave the country so she doesn't get thrown in jail forever. Okay. Other stuff, let's see. Oh, yeah, I'm not done with Margaret Sanger. I don't think so. Um, if you are like super pro-life or super pro-choice, which, you know, might be you know, you might be too young to have decided you're super pro anything politically or as far as causes, but a lot of times when you're young is when you decide these things. You already know a little bit about Margaret Sanger. The group that she starts, the American Birth Control League, turns into the Planned Parenthood. And she's a unique person. She's really odd for her time period. She will end up leaving her husband and leaving the kids with him. Now, to be honest, during this era, the kids would go with whoever the husband said they would go with because, you know, women didn't have as many rights. But she leaves her husband, goes overseas, and hangs out with socialists and rich dudes overseas, and eventually marries an oil millionaire from overseas. And they have an open marriage, which is an incredibly unusual thing then and now, I sort of assume, where you essentially get to keep dating while you're married. So I would tell my high school students she enjoyed practicing birth control as well as lecturing about birth control. He also will write in the 1920s about a science essentially called eugenics, and she'll talk about which ethnic groups she thinks should not be allowed to reproduce because they're producing too many children and they're harmful to society, those ethnic groups and their children. So she will suggest that people should be forcibly sterilized. And, you know, she's going to change her mind about that later. But the problem with that is she wrote it down and published it. So, you know, it's sort of like, I guess in the modern era, you do something stupid and you put it on Instagram or TikTok or something. I don't know where you put stuff for old people, Facebook. And then even if you delete it, people have already seen it. There's ways to preserve it, that sort of thing. You know, she just published stuff. So now she is a very controversial person historically, and she really was unusual for a time period. Emma Goldman's just your standard socialist, but she also thinks that women should have more information about family planning and limitation if they would like it. This isn't as much about abortion, but more about preventing abortion in that era because it was unusual for doctors to perform abortions, plus medical care is not ideal during this time period. So there was a pretty big problem with people trying to give abortions to themselves, poor women not thinking they could afford another child, and that can be pretty much a fatal process. So that's really what motivated Margaret Sanger from stuff that I've read, which is tricky too because almost anything you read about Margaret Sanger is going to be a little bit biased because nobody's neutral about her. You either think she's a hero or you think she's the devil if you're writing about her. So that's a little tricky. Okay. All right. Immigration, we started asking people to check in during this time period. So if you came, it wasn't like, hey, you're tough enough to make it here, you can stay. There were places we wanted you to check in, and we're going to screen you a little bit. Health screening and an IQ screening, a test in English. So if you didn't speak English as your native language, you probably weren't going to do too well on that test. And they screened people for communicable diseases and quarantined you if it seemed like you had one of those. The places you checked in, Ellis Island in New York City. Also, you've probably read a little about this or heard a little about this, Angel Island in San Francisco. If you checked in and you had a name that the clerk couldn't spell or pronounce, you probably got your name changed. Typically, people's names got shortened quite a bit and then anglicized. Maybe the spelling was changed to where it's easier to figure out in English. So you came in with one name and then you left your immigration check-in center with another one. It was possible for Mexican immigrants to find a place to check in, although typically that probably didn't happen. in El Paso or the San Gabriel Valley. So a spot in Texas, a spot in California, but that's such a big long border that it's pretty easy to bypass those spots. And the truth is you could bypass the, Angel Island and Ellis Island as well, although ships were with immigrants were instructed to go there first. There were other places to check in as well, but those are the main ones. And if you did check in, we were able to keep more track of you. Plus, you may have noticed too, there are a lot of commercials about the census right now, because I think it's this Friday is the day where they have to be done collecting census data, and people are encouraged to fill out the census no matter their legal status, because you're here, it's supposed to help determine what sort of public assistance or federal assistance there would be for things like roads and schools, and because whether you're here legally or not, you need roads and schools. We kind of want you to do that if you're here. All right. And women will become a larger part of the workforce during this era because they do, because there's more women in cities. So typically women would work until they were married and have children.
Together. You can download podcasts right to your phone. Every time I finish a podcast, there's a recommendation ready for me with another one.
Oops.
If you're not one of the tens of millions who have the app, download iHeartRadio for free today.
Goodness, somebody's listening to the radio. Hopefully I muted the right person. Hey, if I muted you and it wasn't you, sorry, but I think I muted people. But anyway. All right, back to business. Women got jobs. Probably clerical work, because that becomes more mechanized. They've got adding machines, typewriters, other dictating machines, that sort of thing. So being a secretary becomes more of a female job than a male job. It also pays less. And then if you read the Charlotte Perkins Gilman book, Women in Economics, what she suggests, still true to this day, if you want independence, male or female, you have to be able to pay your own bills. So what I would always advise my high school students when they would tell me, like, I'm just going to tell my parents, I don't care what they think. And it's like, yeah, you know, the best time to do that's when you can pay all your own bills. And by the time you can pay all your own bills, you probably aren't going to tell your parents that anyway, because it just, you know, may not be that useful. All right. So, oh, the other thing I should probably tell you about women, there are women who are doing things other than just getting jobs. You'll start to see women as doctors, lawyers, engineers, a few women in professional jobs. Teaching is going to become more of a woman's job during this era, because we expand public schools, and there's a lot of writing about how women tend to be less likely to smack kids, you know, than men. So they're more gentle and perhaps more nurturing toward learning. So more women are being encouraged to become teachers. As a rule, women who are teachers only get to teach until they have to, because, you know, they got to go home and take care of the kids, because that's kind of the job, at least during this time period. All right. Personal independence. Well, all right. I'm going to stop sharing and look to see if you guys have any questions at this point. Do you guys have any questions? If you try to speak and you can't unmute yourself, let me know. It's probably because you were listening to the iHeartRadio and needed to download the app. I would give you a hard time, but I still mess up the technology too. I know it's different on your end. All right, I'm going to assume you don't have questions. If you do, you know what to do. Type them in. All right, so Henry Ford, have you heard of him? You have an idea what his factories produced, I assume? Some of you perhaps drive those things.
Cars.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for being spokespeople for your class. I appreciate it. So Ford is, making cars, and his goal is to make a democratized automobile. Yes, one that everyone can afford, even including the people who work at the Ford plant. So Ford is a good employer in some ways, and there are other ways you look at him and go like, oh my gosh, what was the man thinking? The stuff that he did that most people think would be good, very safe working environment. Not very exciting because you're doing the same thing over and over, but he's got a moving assembly line, which he really kind of perfects, which makes the company incredibly efficient and productive. He also sets a minimum wage when there is no minimum wage, and he sets it pretty high. It's called the $5 day plan. So he pays his employees enough that if they wanted to buy a Ford vehicle, they would be able to pay that out over time. He also sets up the idea of making payments over time. So he's kind of one of the early car payment kind of guys. And see what else we want to say. So just the idea of mass production and mass consumption is referred to as Fordism. So other manufacturers follow his lead and make these giant plants where things are mass produced. And then, of course, you have to encourage people to buy those things. And you have to produce them in a way where they either wear out, planned obsolescence, or you get new models of things so that you'll want the newest car instead of the one that still works. So advertising is going to become more important in this era, and you'll see it even more important in the 20s. Fordism is also related to the promise of abundance and prosperity, or the American dream, American standard of living, which your book will mention sometimes falls a little short of the advertised plan, because works really well for rich people, kind of works for the management class, doesn't work as well for the working class who works hourly jobs. Although again, Ford among all of these groups really is a pretty good employer. Things that people don't like about Ford when they read about him or write about him or were with him during the time period, they had a behavior code at work. So it wasn't just about how you dressed, it was how you spoke, what words, your language was regulated. They also had Americanization classes. So the assumption was that immigrant workers needed to assimilate. That is the assumption that's pretty typical in all of society during that time period, so not unique to Ford at all. But also, he really was not a fan of the Jews. So he would write columns in his company newsletter where if there were any bad things going on in the United States, he typically blamed the Jews for them. So some rough stuff in there. And that'll come out a little bit more as we get into, say, the 1930s and closer to World War II, when he's going to collaborate with Germany on some things, and that probably is going to be bad for his reputation and his company's reputation. But in this era, we just kind of thought of him as pretty good employer, really good innovator, and he produced a product that people wanted. So we weren't as, I think his social positions weren't as obvious. Also, this is an era where we don't care about your social positions as much. All right, progressive thought during this time period. What is it progressives want to do? They want to make things better from their perspective. So at work, you want things to be safer and more efficient. You could read the Frederick Winslow Taylor book about scientific management. I think it's just called Scientific Management or Scientific Management in the Workplace. It's not really about making the worker happy. It's making the worker more efficient and making him safe. So using less energy to take care of the job. And the job is probably necessarily going to become more boring because you're doing the same thing over and over, but it's probably going to be safer. The goal of progressives during this era was not necessarily to make you happy at work. No one was really concerned about your happiness. So whether your job fulfilled you or not, no one cared. If it paid the bills, that was nice. And if it was easier to do and safer, also good. So science supported these efficient, safe and unimaginative workplace. Socialism, workers' rights, suggested freedom and ownership of a job. So there's a really interesting, perhaps, philosophical discussion in this era about whether employers should have the right to fire employees and whether or not employees have the right to a job, like someone had to hire them. And then once they got hired, they couldn't be fired without consent. They couldn't be forced to move along. Now, there aren't very many business owners who agree with that philosophically, so that doesn't really catch on, but there'll certainly be people who talk about it and write about it. And then the Supreme Court, sometimes supportive of workers, sometimes not. Certainly you'll see the Supreme Court be more supportive of strikes during this era. They're not all given injunctions, they're not all declared illegal. Occasionally the president will intervene on behalf of strikers. That happens from time to time. The international workers of the world in particular will lead some effective strikes in the era. And the Supreme Court will rule on worker protections designated by states a few times. The two cases that I've mentioned there are usually cited in this era, Lochner versus New York and Miller versus Oregon. Both of those cases are kind of about the same thing. They're about if you can limit the number of hours per day that a worker works. So let's talk about those two cases. Lochner versus New York happens first, and it's about people who work at bakeries they're getting hurt on the job because they work 16, 18-hour days. So the state of New York decides to limit the number of hours bakers can work in a day. So 12 hours, I think, was the limit. And these are typically men. Miller versus Oregon, which happens 4 to 6 years later, state of Oregon decides to limit the number of hours workers could work in a laundry, place where they cleaned your clothing each day. And these are primarily female workers. So in the Lochner case, Lochner, who's a business owner, argues that the state of New York has violated workers' Fifth Amendment rights by denying them due process of law and taking away their right to make a living however they see fit. So their argument is maybe people want to work 16 or 18-hour days and get burned. They didn't do anything wrong. You can't punish them. You can't take away this right. The Supreme Court agreed with Lochner, and the New York statutes, which limited the number of hours bakers could work in a day, were repealed. In the Miller case, Miller versus Oregon, the Supreme Court ends up ruling on the side of Oregon, the state. The state will argue, led by Louis Brandeis, who's their lawyer, who will eventually be on the Supreme Court. And by eventually, I mean, within 10 years of this case. They are going to argue that this case is different than Lochner because these are primarily women. And women really should be at home taking care of their families. And when they're not at home, general society suffers. So the Miller case is the first time that social science evidence is introduced in a Supreme Court case and that it's argued effectively. So it's considered a landmark case. Now, if you just look at these and don't analyze them very deeply, what you might conclude is that over time, because Miller sides with Oregon, or excuse me, the Supreme Court sides with Oregon rather than Miller, where before they sided with Lochner, you might conclude that the Supreme Court is becoming more supportive of workers' rights. However, the difference is male workers versus female workers, and because these are primarily female workers in the Miller case, they should probably be at home taking care of the kids because, who knows what dad's going to do with the kids. He'll feed them ice cream, let them play in the street, whatever dads do with kids. Society is better served when women work less and are at home more, is the message of Miller versus Oregon. So it's probably not nearly as progressive as it might seem on the surface. My thoughts. All right. Other laws that are passed during this time period are these amendments. And these amendments are pretty important, as you might imagine. Anytime we have a group of amendments, in this instance, the group is referred to as the progressive amendments because they're passed during the progressive era. These are going to be important. So, 16th Amendment creates an income tax to pay for progressive reforms, possibly to pay for debt left over from the Spanish-American War, but honestly, it was to pay for new stuff. And most people didn't pay the income tax. It wasn't directly taken out of your check because we surely didn't have the technology for that back then, but only about the top 10% of income workers even paid this. So now I think about 50% of income workers pay tax. The other 50% get it all back, all of the income tax, not the other taxes, as you guys well know. 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. So you get to vote for your senator rather than your state government, either legislature or governor, appointing your senator. The thought here is people will have more direct intervention or direct voice in who gets elected, and they'll participate more. They didn't necessarily participate more in voting, but they did have more direct control over who their senator would be. The 18th Amendment, perhaps my favorite, second favorite, I don't know, made alcohol illegal in the United States. I always liked this as a history teacher because kids would get upset and I go like, hey, you're under 21. You're not supposed to be drinking anyway. Yeah. However, the 18th Amendment makes alcohol illegal. You can't sell it, you can't produce it, you can't distribute it, you surely can't drink it. So if you've got it, you broke the law. And a lot of times kids especially will think, well, that's the dumbest amendment I ever heard of. It must have been unpopular. So that's when I get to remind you that if it's a constitutional amendment, it was popular. 2/3 of the states had to agree simply to have the amendment. 3/4 of the states had to agree to pass the amendment. So this is a popular idea. It's enacted in 1920, and we keep it for quite a while until 1933. So we tried out for 13 years. The original goal of the 18th Amendment is to get a very specific group of people to stop drinking. These specific people we don't want to drink are poor men who live in the city. We don't care if rich men drink because we're not going to have to pay for their kids and their wives' health care and rent and stuff like that. We don't care if poor people in the country drink because we don't see them. Nobody lives in the country, not as many people. We really don't care as much if middle class people drink because middle class people probably live on the edge of the cities. We don't see them as much. They take care of their business, that sort of thing. It's really about poor urban guys, and it's a lot of times immigrant guys from Central Eastern Europe who come from traditions where perhaps they drink quite a bit. So a lot of times they're Catholic. They're definitely not Protestant Christians. So that kind of ties in some other prejudices as well. So the true goal of the 18th Amendment is to get that specific group of urban men to stop drinking. In that way, it's fairly successful because once you make the alcohol illegal, it's expensive. It doesn't matter to people who are middle or upper class because they can still afford it and it makes it kind of trendy. Young people who live in the cities who have jobs, so they're not poor, they don't have families, they're probably still going to parties and speakeasies and things like that. It's a pretty small select group of people, but it's an active group, and it's the Great Gatsby group that you'll read about later, perhaps. Poor people, they're just doing their thing. No one cares, really. Poor people in the country, country people. If country people are drinking, no one cares because you don't see it. They probably made their own anyway, and they're putting it in their cars so they can outrun the police if they do get caught. So they create NASCAR from this. So all is great with country people in this. It just doesn't matter as much. However, it does lead to organized crime, which is a problem. So prohibition will often be referred to as the noble experiment, and it lasts for 13 years. So it does solve a few problems. It probably creates more problems than it solves. Kind of depends on whose opinion you listen to there. And then the 19th Amendment, who could argue with that? Women get to vote. A lot of people argued with that. Women had to go on strike, get arrested, hunger strike, all that kind of stuff to get the right to vote. But that happens in 1920. And so we're 100-year anniversary of that. So there you go. All right, so this is an era where government by expert replaces government by politician, leads to city managers versus mayors making day-to-day decisions in local government. There's also a local push for healthy mothers and children as a foundation for a more educated American society. So you'll see more government assistance to women and children, because the assumption there is if women and children aren't being taken care of, it's those drunk guys we're trying to take care of with the 18th Amendment who aren't doing their jobs. So this will also allow the government to intervene a little and get them to eat and drink the right foods, get the right health care, and get the right education to help them assimilate, because the assumption is these are immigrant women, which is often true. And we'll also start regulating and licensing professions like law, medicine, engineering, social work, and teaching. So you'll see upper middle class people starting to go to college in larger numbers, although it's still nowhere close to a majority, to get professional training. And it'll lead to the creation of a small urban middle class who will lead things like the progressive movement. So there you go. All right, I'm going to stop talking for a minute or so and see if you have any questions at this point. And then I'm going to kind of double check the roll. Looks like I got everybody. All right, so what questions do you have at this moment? And if you need me to unmute you, because I muted a couple of you, sorry, but you know, I heard stuff. All right, do you guys have any questions at all?
I'm gonna say that's no.
I'm starting to think that myself. Okay, I'm just typing an answer to somebody, sorry. I'm going to stop recording.